Welcome back, focused learners. All right, today we're diving into a truly fascinating explainer. We're looking at a highly academic manuscript called the Mahdi equation. And get this, we're going to examine a theoretical framework that actually attempts to apply complex mathematical probability directly to ancient theology. It's wild stuff. So let's just jump right in and see exactly how structured numbers can intersect with religious texts.
Right out of the gate, the manuscript asks an absolutely mind-bending question. Could a mathematical tool theoretically test a religious text for a non-human origin? I mean, we're so used to analyzing history or linguistics when it comes to ancient scriptures, right? But the author here is taking a strictly statistical approach to the Quran to see if there's an embedded, calculable signature.
And that brings us to the manuscript's headline statistical claim. Under what the author calls a cautious public-facing model, the cumulative Bayes factor favors divine authorship over human authorship by roughly 5.31 million to 1. That is a massive number, literally millions to 1. But you're probably wondering, where exactly does this number come from and what is it actually measuring? Let's break the whole thing down.
Moving into Section 1, we have the core hypothesis, looking specifically at the ADI framework and the two models.
Okay, so this equation, Q sub d equals T of K sub g, represents the ADI, or authorial divine intent, framework. Now, the premise here isn't that mathematics is God, or, that God is somehow physically on paper. Rather, it suggests that domain G, which stands for uncreated divine knowledge, is transfigured. That's the T. It's transfigured into domain D. And domain D is just our created, structured world, right? Things like language, math, history. The author argues that if this transfiguration actually happens, it should leave behind a distinct signature of superhuman compression, kind of like a massive zip file of data.
So, to test this, the manuscript rigorously pits two competing hypotheses against each other. On one hand, we have H sub d, the hypothesis that the Quran is divine revelation transfigured into created Arabic. On the flip side, we have H sub h, the hypothesis that it's just purely human-authored discourse from late antique Arabia. Now, as an impartial explainer, our goal today definitely isn't to pick a side. We're just here to look at exactly how the manuscript calculates the odds between these two ideas.
Let's transition to Section 2, the mathematical tool. We need to understand the Bayes factor. If you're not familiar, a Bayes factor is essentially just a ratio. It simply compares how likely a given set of evidence is under Hypothesis 1 versus Hypothesis 2. Now, to make sure they aren't exaggerating the argument by just overcounting every little pattern as some isolated miracle, the author deliberately groups the evidence into clusters. This creates a built-in penalty, and really importantly, it keeps the math grounded.
Which brings us to Section 3, the multi-code architecture. We're going to break down codes 7, 11, and 19.
All right, the very first cluster is code 7, which the manuscript identifies as a consistent marker of sacred completion. We see 7 heavens mentioned, 7 gates of hell, and the 7 circuits around the Kaaba in ritual practice. Even the 25 named prophets reduce mathematically right back to 7, since, 2 plus 5 equals 7. The author argues this structural repetition of the number 7 is absolutely a deliberate cosmological pattern.
Next up, we shift to code 11. Now, according to the text, while 7 represents the cosmos, 11 functions specifically as the prophetic signature. It's uniquely tied to the Prophet Muhammad, and it weaves its way through history and the text's very letter-level architecture. Check this out. Using the Arabic alphanumeric system known as Abjad, the name Muhammad has a value of 92, and 9 plus 2, that equals 11. Surah Muhammad has exactly 38 verses. 3 plus 8 equals 11. Historically speaking, the Prophet's death occurred in 11 AH. The manuscript compiles all these correlations together to argue for a highly compressed historical and textual code 11 cluster. It's pretty fascinating. And then we have code 19. The manuscript presents this as the text's macro authentication layer. So for example, there are 114 total surahs, right? Which is precisely 6 times 19. The opening formula, the basmala, contains exactly 19 letters. Even the phrase Allahu Akbar has an abjad value of 289, and what do you know? 2 plus 8 plus 9 equals 19. According to the author, the structural closure here is just incredibly tightly interwoven.
Moving right along to Section 4, scientific and structural resonance. We'll be looking at iron, symmetries, and earth.
Now, this part is absolutely crucial. We're looking at the number 26, specifically focusing on Surah Al-Hadid, which literally translates to iron. The Arabic word hadid has an exact abjad value of 26, and in chemistry, the atomic number of iron is exactly 26.
The manuscript highlights this direct, precise correspondence between the text's alphanumeric value and modern elemental science as a highly significant cluster.
But it really doesn't stop there. The manuscript dives into word frequencies as well. It points out that the ratio of the words for land to sea in the text yields a split of exactly 28.9% to 71.1%. And to put that into perspective, that mathematically mirrors the actual geological surface distribution of our Earth. Seriously? How crazy is that?
And an analysis perfectly illustrates this amazing semantic balance. Mentions of good deeds appear exactly 167 times. Mentions of wrongdoings? Exactly 167 times. Life and death both appear exactly 145 times. The author treats this immense, perfect word frequency symmetry as really powerful evidence of non-human textual compression.
We also see this deep structural architecture in specific verses, like Ayat al-Kursi, which is a famous verse about divine sovereignty. First, it's positioned exactly at verse 255. Mathematically speaking, 255 is equal to 2 to the power of 8 minus 1. In binary, that is 8 solid ones. It's a complete 8-bit data field. The author notes how the sheer mathematical position of the verse, perfectly, almost poetically, intertwines with its literal meaning of complete, sovereign coverage of the created order.
Okay, let's get into Section 5, calculating the final odds. Here we're looking at the likelihood models.
So the author impartially scales 3 different likelihood models to compare them. If you apply an extremely skeptical model, one with really heavy discounts, the Bayes factor still favors the divine hypothesis by about 3,000 to 1. If you use the cautious model, it yields over 5 million to 1. And the balanced model, functioning inside the ADI framework, that shoots all the way up into the hundreds of trillions. The numbers scale entirely based on the specific evidential constraints that are applied.
Now, to put this all into perspective, Bayes' theorem uses what's called a prior probability, basically your starting assumption. The author explains that even if you start with an extremely skeptical prior, meaning let's say you give a mere 0.1% chance at the very outset that the text is divine, applying the cautious model's mathematical convergence still results in a massive statistical shift. It brings the posterior probability all the way up to 99.98%.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Safeguards and Limitations. Let's talk about grounding the theory.
As the author directly points out, these are model-based likelihood ratios. They are not empirical physical laws measured in a laboratory, right? They require strict counting rules, like exactly how you tokenize Arabic words or calculate specific letter values. So the real value of this framework is that it puts all of the assumptions completely out on the table so they can be audited, tested, and debated logically by anyone.
Which leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for this explainer. The manuscript really leaves us with a compelling question. If this is purely human-authored, how does one single text from late antiquity manage to sustain this incredible level of multidimensional convergence? You have linguistic balance, mathematical primes, scientific resonance, and deep historical layers all aligning completely simultaneously. It's a massive, fascinating structural puzzle. I really hope this explainer helped make the math behind it just a little clearer for you today. Keep learning, stay curious, and thanks so much for joining me.